It was just another ordinary day for Officer Jack Reynolds. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty streets as he cruised down the quiet suburban neighborhood. He had been on patrol for hours, his radio buzzing with routine calls and updates, none of which seemed to break the monotony of his day. He'd been on the force for years, and each day felt more like the last. He was used to the same streets, the same people, the same patterns. He knew his routine, and nothing ever seemed to surprise him. As he turned a corner, his eyes caught sight of a car ahead of him, a black sedan. It sped past a red light without slowing down. He felt a brief spark of annoyance. People like this were always in a rush, always thinking they were above the rules. He had seen it countless times before, drivers thinking they could break the law without consequence. Officer Reynolds' hand instinctively moved toward his radio, ready to call in the stop. He flicked on his siren and pulled up behind a car, a small sense of satisfaction looming in his chest. It was rare for him to get a chance to enforce the rules on a driver who seemed so obviously careless. He wasn't just a cop for the uniform. He was a cop because he liked to feel the power of keeping order, of reminding people who was in charge. As he approached the black sedan, he noticed the driver's side windows slowly rolling down. He could already see the silhouette of the person inside, a shadowy figure, but nothing about it stood out. The car was an expensive model, one that he figured was owned by someone who thought rules didn't apply to them. Officer Reynolds, in his usual confidence, placed his hand on his holster as he approached the vehicle. The driver didn't seem nervous. In fact, they seemed almost too calm, which only added to the officer's growing annoyance. Was this person trying to act like they were untouchable? His thoughts ran wild as he walked closer, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. "License and registration," he barked, his voice sharp and firm, his eyes scanning the driver's face, looking for any hint of guilt or nervousness. There was none. The driver remained still, not fidgeting or showing any signs of being worried. Instead, the man inside the car met his gaze, his expression unreadable. For a split second, Officer Reynolds was taken aback. The calmness in the driver's eyes was unusual. Most people got nervous when they were pulled over, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. This man, though, was unfazed. The driver slowly reached for his glove compartment and pulled out his registration. As he handed it over to Officer Reynolds, the officer's gaze flickered down, noticing the uniform the man was wearing. It was a police uniform. The badge was clear and prominent, and for the first time that day, Officer Reynolds felt his confidence waver. The man in the car wasn't just any civilian. He was a police officer, one wearing a high-ranking uniform. Officer Reynolds felt his breath catch. His initial irritation shifted, now replaced with a quiet wave of embarrassment. He looked more closely at the man's face, and that's when the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any police officer. This was Captain Marcus Johnson, the head of the department. The same Captain Johnson he had seen during briefing sessions, on posters around the precinct, and in news stories. Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face. His heart began to race. What had he just done? He had pulled over one of the highest-ranking officers in his department, the very man who was in charge of many of the officers he worked with. What was supposed to be a routine stop now felt like a massive mistake. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind scrambled for a response, for anything to say. He had made a mistake. No, a huge blunder. And now there was no way to take it back. Captain Johnson's gaze remained steady, unfazed by the situation. He looked at Officer Reynolds, who now stood there awkwardly, the weight of his error hanging between them like a thick fog. Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't show any sign of being upset. Instead, he simply nodded, his demeanor calm and professional. "I'll be honest with you, Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice cool but firm. "I know why you pulled me over, but you've made a mistake." Reynolds' mind raced, trying to piece together the situation. Was this a joke? Was this some kind of test? He couldn't believe it. The captain, the man he had always looked up to, was the one in front of him, and it was because of his own prejudice that this whole thing was happening. Reynolds stammered, still trying to find the right words, but none came. He was speechless, his hands now shaking, the realization sinking in deeper. He had been so quick to make assumptions about the driver, about who they were, without considering the bigger picture. He had let his bias dictate his actions, and now he was facing the very consequences of it. In that moment, Officer Reynolds understood that he wasn't just facing the embarrassment of pulling over his superior officer. He was also facing the reality of his own biases, the ones he had been unaware of, the ones he had never stopped to question. The truth was clear now. His actions had been wrong from the start. But how could he fix it? How could he undo what he had just done? Captain Johnson didn't rush to judge him. Instead, he simply waited, letting Officer Reynolds process the situation, his calm presence a stark contrast to the officer's growing sense of guilt. Officer Reynolds stood there, his heart pounding, trying to come to terms with what had just happened. The weight of the mistake he'd made was heavier than anything he had ever felt. He had pulled over one of his own, someone he had always respected, and now the realization of his own biases hit him with full force. As Captain Marcus Johnson sat quietly in the car, waiting for the officer to speak, Reynolds found himself at a loss for words. He could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck. He had assumed that because of the way the driver looked, or perhaps the car they were driving, that this person was just another ordinary citizen, someone to reprimand. But that assumption had been wrong, and now the weight of it was beginning to crush him. For a few moments, there was only silence between them. Officer Reynolds had no idea what to say. What could he say? His thoughts were racing in every direction. Regret, shame, confusion. He had acted on an impulse, on preconceived notions about people that he didn't even realize were there. He hadn't thought for a second about the possibility that the person in the car might be someone important, someone who had more experience, more authority, and more responsibility than he could ever imagine. Captain Johnson broke the silence, his voice calm and collected. "It's okay, Officer Reynolds. You made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you're a bad officer. It means you need to take a step back and look at how you approach situations like this." Reynolds blinked, still trying to process what the captain had said. His mind was still spinning, caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. Was it really okay? Could something like this just be brushed off? He had pulled over a man in charge of his entire department, a man who had the power to make or break his career. What would happen next? Was this the end for him? The captain continued, not giving Reynolds a chance to spiral further into his own thoughts. "I want you to understand something. Racial profiling, or judging people based on their appearance, isn't just something we see in the news. It's something that happens every day. And it doesn't just happen to people of color. It happens to people in all walks of life. But it is particularly damaging when it comes to how we treat others based on their skin color." Reynolds swallowed hard, trying to digest the words. He could feel his stomach twist as the realization set in. He hadn't just made a simple mistake. He had made a mistake that was tied to something much bigger, something that had the power to hurt people. This wasn't just about him. It was about how he had treated someone based on his own assumptions, based on the way that person looked. Captain Johnson took a deep breath, his tone still calm, but there was a firmness to it that commanded respect. "You're not the only one who makes mistakes like this, Reynolds. We all have biases. We all have things we don't even realize are influencing how we treat others. But the important thing is recognizing that we have them and working to change them." Officer Reynolds' hands were still shaking, but he wasn't shaking from fear. It was something else, an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He realized that the captain wasn't just teaching him a lesson about being a better cop. He was teaching him how to be a better person, how to see the world in a way that wasn't clouded by assumptions or stereotypes. "Let me ask you something, Officer Reynolds," Captain Johnson said, breaking the officer's thoughts. "Why did you pull me over in the first place?" Reynolds hesitated. The question was straightforward, but it was a question that required him to confront something deep within himself. "Because you ran a red light," he said quietly, his voice almost inaudible. "And why did you assume you needed to stop me?" Reynolds looked at the captain, not fully understanding where this was going. I thought you were just another driver, breaking the rules. I thought maybe you weren't paying attention. I thought maybe you were in a hurry, or maybe I didn't fit the image of the typical person who might break the rules." Captain Johnson finished for him. "That's the problem. When you make assumptions about people based on how they look or what they're driving, you're not seeing them as individuals. You're seeing them through a lens that's already been shaped by what society tells us to think." Reynolds took a deep breath, his thoughts shifting again. He could feel the sting of truth in those words. He had been operating on autopilot, reacting to things he had seen over the years without truly considering the impact of his actions. He had been so sure of what he was doing, and yet here he was, standing in front of a man who had done nothing wrong, yet had been wrongly targeted. I didn't think," Reynolds murmured, his voice filled with regret. Captain Johnson gave a small nod. "That's the thing, Officer Reynolds. None of us think about it enough. We go through life making assumptions, believing stereotypes, and acting on biases without realizing how much damage they can cause. But that doesn't have to define you. The fact that you're recognizing this now, in this moment, means you have a chance to change." The officer was quiet, absorbing the weight of the conversation. His mind was starting to shift, slowly but surely. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was about confronting the biases he had been carrying with him, the ones he didn't even know he had. It was about breaking free from the assumptions that had shaped his actions. Captain Johnson's words had opened his eyes. They had given him a glimpse of a different way of thinking, one that was more aware, more compassionate. And in that moment, Officer Reynolds realized that his journey wasn't just about becoming a better cop, it was about becoming a better human being. The captain wasn't just offering him a lesson on police work, he was offering him a lesson on life. A lesson that Reynolds would carry with him, not just for the rest of his shift, but for the rest of his career and beyond. The silence between Officer Reynolds and Captain Johnson felt heavy, almost suffocating. The weight of the conversation that had just unfolded settled on Reynolds' shoulders like a pile of bricks. His mind was still racing, trying to come to terms with what had happened. He had spent years on the force, always thinking of himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules, someone who respected authority. But now, standing here, facing Captain Johnson, everything he thought he knew about himself was beginning to crumble. Captain Johnson's calm demeanor had been a stark contrast to Reynolds' inner turmoil. He was a man who had spent years building a career, leading others, earning the respect of his colleagues. And here he was, pulling over an officer of his own department, caught in a moment that could have easily turned into something far worse. Yet, instead of anger or frustration, the captain was offering him something far more valuable: understanding. "Reynolds," Captain Johnson's voice broke the silence once again. "I'm not angry at you. I'm disappointed, yes, but I'm not angry. We all make mistakes. The question is, what are you going to do with this moment? Are you going to learn from it, or are you going to let it pass by like every other mistake you've made before?" Reynolds swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. He had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this wasn't like any challenge he had faced before. This wasn't about a criminal or a dangerous situation. This was about something far more personal. This was about his own beliefs, his own biases, and the way he had treated someone based solely on their appearance. I don't know," Reynolds finally muttered, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to fix it." Captain Johnson nodded, as if he had expected this response. "It's not easy," he said quietly. "Changing the way you think, the way you see the world, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's not something you can just forget about. But what I can tell you is this: it's never too late to start. It's never too late to make the choice to be better. Reynolds looked up at the captain, his eyes filled with doubt. But I've been doing this job for years. I've been doing it the same way without questioning myself. Now I find out that I've been wrong all along. How do I fix that? How do I make it right? Captain Johnson gave him a knowing look. It starts with being honest with yourself. It starts with admitting that we all have biases, even if we don't realize it. We all carry assumptions about people, whether we want to admit it or not. The key is recognizing them and taking action to change. That's the first step. The rest comes with time. Reynolds took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words sink in. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, someone who stood by his principles. But now he realized that his principles were flawed, clouded by assumptions he had never questioned. He had seen people through a lens that wasn't truly his own. It was a lens shaped by years of societal influence, a lens that didn't take into account the full complexity of the world around him. But how do I do that? Reynolds asked, his voice more serious now. How do I change the way I've been thinking? How do I even start? Captain Johnson's expression softened. It starts with the little things, Reynolds. It starts with how you see people, how you interact with them. When you pull someone over, for example, don't just assume you know their story. Don't assume you know what kind of person they are based on how they look or what they're driving. Treat them with respect, as you would want to be treated. Give them the benefit of the doubt. And if you ever find yourself slipping back into old habits, remind yourself that you are better than that. Reynolds nodded slowly, the weight of the captain's words settling in. He had been quick to judge, quick to assume that a person's outward appearance told the whole story. He had failed to see the human being behind the uniform, behind the car, behind the skin color. He had seen a stereotype, not an individual. I guess I've been living in a bubble, Reynolds said quietly, almost to himself. I never really thought about it this way. I've always just done my job the way I was taught. I didn't realize how much I was letting my own biases affect what I did. Captain Johnson's gaze softened even more. It's not easy to admit, but it's a start. The fact that you're aware of it now is important. You can't change the past, but you can change how you move forward. Reynolds took another deep breath, feeling the weight on his chest slowly begin to lift. He still felt uneasy, but now it was more of a feeling of determination, a desire to do better. The captain had given him something that he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that he could be better, that he could make a difference, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. I don't know if I'm ready to change overnight, Reynolds admitted, but I'm willing to try. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. Captain Johnson smiled slightly, a gesture that conveyed both encouragement and understanding. That's all anyone can ask for, Reynolds. It's not about being perfect. It's about making the effort, every day. It's about learning, growing, and being aware of how you impact the people around you. As the two men stood there, Officer Reynolds felt something shift within him. He didn't know exactly how this journey would unfold, but he was certain that he was ready to take the first step. He was ready to change. And with that, the encounter, though unexpected and uncomfortable, had become a turning point. It was the moment that marked the beginning of a new way of thinking, one where assumptions no longer held power over him, and where respect for others was the driving force behind every action he took. The conversation between Officer Reynolds and Captain Johnson continued, each word from the captain hitting Reynolds like a wake-up call. The captain wasn't just offering advice. He was offering a chance for growth, a chance for Reynolds to redefine what it meant to be a good officer, and more importantly, a good person. Reynolds stood there, his thoughts swirling, trying to make sense of everything. The weight of his biases, which he had carried without even realizing it, was now more evident than ever. He had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume the worst about people, simply because of the way they looked or the car they drove. And now, in front of him, the captain had not only pointed out his mistake, but had also given him a blueprint for change. I've never really thought about it like that, Reynolds admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I mean, I know we're supposed to uphold the law, but I didn't realize how much my assumptions were affecting my actions. Captain Johnson nodded, understanding. We're all products of our environment, Reynolds. We're taught certain things, and sometimes we don't even realize how deeply they've rooted themselves in our minds. But being aware of it is the first step. Once you see it, you can start changing it. Reynolds took a deep breath. It wasn't just about his job as a police officer. It was about being a better person, someone who looked beyond surface-level judgments and truly understood others. He had thought he was doing his job well, that he was doing what was expected of him. But now, he understood that he had missed the bigger picture. Do you think it's possible to change? Reynolds asked, his voice filled with doubt. He had spent so many years in this career, so many years doing things the way he had been taught. Could he really make a difference in how he viewed others, especially in his line of work? Captain Johnson met his gaze, his eyes steady and full of confidence. Absolutely. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy, but it's possible. It starts with the small things, the way you speak to people, the way you treat them when you pull them over, the way you listen to them. When you make an effort to see people as individuals, instead of just stereotypes, that's when real change happens. Reynolds nodded slowly, still uncertain, but feeling a glimmer of hope. He knew the captain was right. He had been living in a bubble, seeing the world in a way that was narrow and biased. But now, as he stood there listening to the captain's wisdom, he realized that he had the power to change, that he didn't have to stay stuck in the same patterns. So, what do I do now? Reynolds asked, his voice filled with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. He wanted to make things right. He wanted to be better, but he wasn't sure where to start. Start by reflecting, Captain Johnson said. Take some time to think about the way you approach people. Think about the assumptions you make, the judgments you pass, and then ask yourself, is that how I would want to be treated? Is that the person I want to be? Reynolds listened intently, his mind processing the captain's words. He knew he had a lot to learn, a lot of work to do. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a clear path forward. I think I've been focusing too much on the rules, and not enough on the people behind those rules, Reynolds admitted. I've always thought of myself as a good cop because I followed the law. But I've never really thought about how my actions impact the people I'm supposed to protect. Captain Johnson smiled, a small, approving smile that made Reynolds feel a bit more at ease. It's a good start. But remember, the law isn't just a set of rules. It's about protecting and serving people. The rules matter, of course, but how you treat people is what matters most. When you can balance the two, that's when you're truly doing your job well. Reynolds felt a sense of relief wash over him. For so long, he had felt like he was simply going through the motions, just another officer doing his job without really understanding the deeper purpose behind it. But now, he saw the bigger picture. He wasn't just there to enforce the law. He was there to help people, to make a real difference in their lives. Thank you, Captain, Reynolds said, his voice sincere. I don't think I've fully understood what this job is about until now. I know I have a lot of work to do, but I'm ready to start. I want to be better. Captain Johnson nodded, his expression proud but gentle. I believe you will be, Reynolds. It's not about being perfect. It's about making an effort every day to do better. And I've got no doubt you'll get there. As the two men stood there, the air between them felt lighter. The tension that had been present earlier had faded, replaced by a newfound sense of understanding and mutual respect. Reynolds knew that this moment, this conversation, had changed him. It was a turning point in his life, one that would affect not just how he approached his job, but how he interacted with the world around him. Captain Johnson clapped him on the back, a gesture that felt reassuring. We all make mistakes, Reynolds. It's what we do with them that counts. I'm confident you'll take what you've learned here and use it to make a real difference. Just remember to keep reflecting, Keep questioning your assumptions, and always treat people with respect." Reynolds smiled, a genuine smile that felt different from any he had given in a long time. He felt lighter, more at peace with himself. He knew he wasn't perfect, and he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to take the first step. And that was all that mattered. As the two of them parted ways, Reynolds couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. He wasn't sure exactly what would come next, but he knew that, for the first time in a long time, he was on the right path. A path that would lead him not just to being a better officer, but to being a better person. As Officer Reynolds drove back to the precinct after his conversation with Captain Johnson, his mind was still buzzing. He had expected the usual quiet drive, the kind where he let his thoughts drift away, and the day's routine seemed like a blur. But today, everything felt different. The weight of his actions, his mistakes, and the captain's wise words were still heavy on his mind. He couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over again. The captain's calm demeanor, his understanding, and the way he had so easily recognized the biases that had guided Reynolds' actions. It was as though, for the first time in years, Reynolds was seeing his job and his life from a new perspective. He realized that it wasn't enough to just follow the rules. It wasn't enough to assume that every person he interacted with could be neatly labeled or categorized. There was so much more to each person, so much more to their stories, and now he was beginning to understand that. The drive felt longer than usual, almost like the road ahead was symbolizing the long journey he now had to take to change. He wasn't sure how long it would take to undo the years of conditioning, to peel away the layers of assumptions that had built up in his mind, but he knew one thing for sure. He was committed to the process. As he pulled into the precinct's parking lot, Reynolds parked his car and sat for a moment, staring at the building ahead of him. The lights in the office windows flickered softly, a reminder of the long hours ahead and the work that still needed to be done. But for the first time, Reynolds wasn't focused on the routine. He wasn't just thinking about paperwork or the next call. He was thinking about how he would go about his work differently from now on. He knew that being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about the people. It was about their lives, their stories, and their needs. And the way he approached his job needed to reflect that understanding. He couldn't keep making assumptions. He couldn't keep letting his biases dictate his actions. He had to do better, not just for his own sake, but for everyone he interacted with. Inside the precinct, the usual chatter of officers filled the air. Reynolds couldn't help but notice how much the conversations around him seemed to be about the same things: traffic stops, criminal cases, and the latest neighborhood issues. It was as though the department was just moving through its daily routines, ticking off tasks without ever stopping to question why they were doing them or how they were affecting the people they served. The realization hit him again. His work had to be more than just checking boxes. It had to be meaningful. As he made his way to his desk, his thoughts continued to race. He hadn't had the chance to reflect on what Captain Johnson had said in full until now. It wasn't just about changing how he interacted with people during traffic stops or on patrol. It was about changing how he saw people, about treating everyone with respect and empathy, not because it was part of the job, but because it was the right thing to do. He had to start seeing people as individuals with their own lives, their own struggles, and their own stories. No longer could he allow preconceived ideas to influence his decisions. That night, when Reynolds went home, he sat in the quiet of his apartment, thinking about what had happened earlier in the day. It was hard to shake off the guilt of the traffic stop. He still felt uncomfortable about the mistake he had made, but he also understood that guilt wasn't something that would help him improve. Instead, he focused on the captain's words again, the idea that change starts with self-awareness, that by recognizing his flaws, he had already taken the first step toward making a difference. He was committed to doing the work, not just for his job, but for his community and for himself. The next few days at work were filled with small but meaningful changes. Reynolds found himself taking extra time to talk to people during his patrols. He would listen more carefully to their words, to their stories, and he made an effort to connect with them on a deeper level. It was as though a new understanding had clicked into place. He noticed how the simple act of listening made a difference. People felt seen, heard, and respected, and Reynolds could see the impact of this change in their reactions. It wasn't always easy, but the rewards were undeniable. He found that, in turn, he felt more connected to the people he served. His interactions, which had once felt like routine tasks, now felt like opportunities to make a real difference. There were moments, of course, when old habits tried to creep back in. There were times when Reynolds felt a surge of doubt, wondering if he was truly capable of making such a drastic shift in the way he approached his job. But then he would think back to the conversation with Captain Johnson. He would remind himself that change wasn't immediate, that it was a process, and that he didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep trying, keep moving forward, and keep learning from every encounter. One afternoon, while he was on a routine patrol, Reynolds pulled over a car for a minor traffic violation. As he approached the vehicle, the driver, an older woman, smiled at him, nervously but kindly. Normally, Reynolds might have been quick to give a warning or a fine, but today he paused. He took a moment to notice her, to see her as an individual rather than just a driver breaking the rules. When he asked her how her day had been, she relaxed, and they exchanged a few friendly words before he let her off with just a verbal warning. The encounter was brief, but it reminded him why he had become a police officer in the first place: to help people, not just to enforce the law. That small interaction was a moment of clarity for Reynolds. He wasn't just patrolling a neighborhood or writing tickets. He was engaging with people, understanding them, and treating them as equals. And in doing so, he felt more fulfilled than ever before. Reynolds knew he had a long way to go, but with each step, he felt more certain that he was on the right path. He had learned that change wasn't about a single decision. It was about a series of small choices made every day. It was about being aware, being patient, and always striving to be better. And for the first time in a long time, Reynolds felt hopeful about the future. As the weeks passed, Officer Reynolds continued his journey toward change. He had started making small adjustments in the way he approached his work, and slowly he could see the impact. It wasn't just about following the captain's advice. It was about embracing a new mindset, one that was centered around empathy, respect, and understanding. Each day, Reynolds worked harder to apply this new perspective, and the results were starting to become clear. One afternoon, Reynolds was assigned to a neighborhood that had been dealing with an uptick in petty crimes. It was a neighborhood where many people lived in difficult circumstances, where some residents had long felt neglected by the authorities. In the past, Reynolds would have approached this assignment with a sense of duty, focused solely on enforcing the law, but today, something felt different. He knew that there was more to the story than just the rules. There were people in this neighborhood who had lives beyond the crime reports, people who had been shaped by experiences that Reynolds couldn't fully understand. As he walked down the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the area, he noticed a group of young people gathered near a street corner. In the past, Reynolds might have felt a surge of suspicion, wondering if trouble was brewing. But today, instead of immediately jumping to conclusions, he decided to take a different approach. He walked over to the group, his demeanor calm and friendly, and introduced himself. The group seemed surprised at first. Most of them were used to officers arriving with a sense of authority, ready to lay down the law. But Reynolds wasn't there to lecture them. He wasn't there to catch them in the act of something wrong. Instead, he started a conversation. He asked them about their day, about their lives, and they responded with a mix of hesitation and curiosity. "I know things haven't always been easy around here," Reynolds said, speaking gently, "but I just want you to know that I'm here to help. I'm not here to judge you. I just want to get to know you and make sure you feel safe." At first, the group seemed uncertain. They had seen too many officers pass by with little more than a stern look, a ticket, or a warning. But as the conversation continued, something changed. They started to open up. They shared their frustrations about the neighborhood. about the challenges they faced and the lack of opportunities. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was meaningful. Reynolds wasn't just an officer with a badge. He was someone who listened, someone who cared. Later that day, as he continued his patrol, Reynolds reflected on what had just happened. He had never realized how much of his job had been about simply enforcing laws and not about connecting with the people he was meant to serve. In that moment, he understood that law enforcement wasn't just about keeping order. It was about building relationships, about being a presence that people could trust. For the first time, he felt like he was truly making a difference, not by issuing tickets or arrests, but by showing kindness and concern. That night, as Reynolds sat at his desk, filling out reports, he couldn't help but think back to the words Captain Johnson had shared with him. "It starts with the small things," the captain had said. Reynolds had always focused on the big picture, crime rates, arrests, and enforcing the law. But now, he realized that it was the small things, the everyday moments, that had the power to make the most significant impact. He wasn't just a cop. He was a part of the community, someone who could help change the environment around him with simple acts of kindness and understanding. The next week, Reynolds had another encounter that reaffirmed his belief in this new approach. He had been called to a domestic disturbance in an apartment complex. When he arrived, the scene was tense. The couple involved was shouting at each other, and the atmosphere felt charged. In the past, Reynolds would have immediately stepped in, trying to defuse the situation with authority, perhaps even separating the couple or issuing a warning. But today, he took a different approach. Instead of raising his voice, he spoke calmly, asking both parties to take a step back and listen. "I know things are hard right now," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But yelling at each other isn't going to solve anything. Let's take a moment to breathe, and we can talk about this." At first, the couple seemed resistant. They had been through this many times before, and the last thing they expected was for a police officer to listen to them, instead of just offering an ultimatum. But Reynolds didn't back down. He patiently asked them to explain their frustrations and listened without judgment. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. By the end of the conversation, both parties were calmer, and they agreed to seek counseling to help address their issues. As Reynolds left the apartment complex, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He hadn't solved all their problems, but he had done something important. He had shown up not as an enforcer of rules, but as a human being, someone who was willing to listen and offer support. And that was more than he had ever done before. As the days went on, Reynolds continued to reflect on his journey. He knew there would be challenges ahead. Old habits die hard, and not every situation could be resolved with kindness and understanding. But he also knew that he was on the right path. He had learned that his job was more than just a profession. It was a way to serve others, to be a positive influence in their lives, and to make a real difference, no matter how small the act. Reynolds had come a long way from that moment when he had pulled over Captain Johnson. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there was still work to be done. But every day, he felt like he was becoming a better officer, a better person. And with that, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness had the biggest impact, and he was determined to carry that lesson with him for the rest of his career. As the months went by, Officer Reynolds noticed a significant change not just in himself, but in the way he saw his role within the community. Each day, he felt more connected to the people he served, more aware of their struggles, and more determined to make a positive difference. His approach to policing had shifted from a rigid enforcement of the law to a deeper understanding of the people behind the violations. His newfound perspective wasn't just transforming the way he interacted with others, it was also transforming the way he felt about his job. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Reynolds sat down at a small cafe, reflecting on how far he had come. The weight of his previous mistakes and biases no longer consumed him. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. He wasn't just doing his job. He was contributing to something greater. He realized that, in many ways, his role as a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about being a beacon of support, a source of help when things went wrong, and a trusted figure in moments of need. That night, as Reynolds sat with his coffee, a thought crossed his mind. He remembered the conversation he had with Captain Johnson months ago, the captain's calm wisdom, and the way he had urged Reynolds to see people for who they truly were. It was that conversation that had set him on a new path, and he felt grateful for it. He had learned that biases and assumptions didn't just affect individuals, they affected entire communities. And now, as he looked around, he began to see his community with new eyes. The next day, Reynolds was called to a domestic dispute in a quiet neighborhood. He had responded to these types of calls before, and they were always challenging. People were often angry and upset, and tempers flared quickly. But as he approached the scene this time, he felt different. He wasn't just going to do his job the way he had in the past. He wasn't just going to be a neutral figure in the middle of a confrontation. He was going to listen, and he was going to show empathy. When Reynolds arrived, the couple involved in the dispute was already shouting at each other. The woman, standing near the door, was visibly upset, while the man was pacing back and forth, frustration written on his face. The air between them was tense, and Reynolds could see how the situation had escalated. But instead of immediately stepping in with force, Reynolds took a deep breath and walked up to the woman. "I can see that you're upset," he said softly, making eye contact with her. "I want to hear what's going on. Let's talk about it." His voice was calm, soothing even, and it had an effect. The woman stopped for a moment, looking at him with wide eyes, surprised that he wasn't demanding answers or raising his voice. Slowly, she began to speak, explaining her side of the argument. As Reynolds listened, he noticed how the tension in her voice started to fade. She wasn't speaking to him as an authority figure or an enforcer of the law. She was speaking to him as a person, and that was exactly what he needed to be. Not just a cop, but someone who understood and who cared. After giving the woman a chance to express herself, Reynolds turned to the man. He was still pacing, but his movements had slowed. "I'd like to hear your side too," Reynolds said gently. "I know things are tense, but we need to figure this out together." The man looked at him for a moment, as if deciding whether to trust him. But then he stopped pacing and nodded. He started to speak, his words tumbling out as he shared his frustrations. Reynolds listened carefully, not interrupting, giving both parties space to express their feelings. He wasn't there to take sides or make judgments. He was there to help them resolve the situation in a calm, productive way. By the time the conversation reached its conclusion, both the man and the woman seemed calmer. They had expressed their feelings, and most importantly, they had felt heard. After a while, they both agreed to take a break from each other and to seek counseling. Reynolds knew that this wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. What mattered most was that they hadn't been treated like criminals. They had been treated like people who were struggling, people who needed support, and people who were worthy of respect. As Reynolds left the scene, he felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond simply resolving the dispute. He knew that his role as a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about helping people in their most vulnerable moments. It was about giving them the space to be heard, to be understood, and to find a way forward. The next day, as Reynolds patrolled the streets, he noticed that his interactions with people felt more genuine, more meaningful. He wasn't just going through the motions of his job. He was actively trying to make a positive impact on the community. Whether it was a simple conversation with a local shopkeeper, a quick check-in with a resident, or just offering a friendly smile, he was slowly earning the trust of the people he served. For the first time in his career, Reynolds didn't feel like an outsider in the community. He felt like a part of it. He had spent so many years simply doing his job, keeping order, and making arrests, but now he understood that being a good officer was about so much more than that. It was about building relationships, showing kindness, and earning respect through actions, not just authority. One afternoon, a local store owner waved him down as he passed by. "Hey, Officer Reynolds," she called out. "Thanks for the other day. My son was worried when you stopped by, but when you talked to him, he felt a lot better. I really appreciate it." Reynolds smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I'm just doing my job," he said, but the sincerity in his voice spoke volumes. This was what it was all about, connecting with people, being there when they needed support, and helping to make their lives a little easier. As Reynolds continued to serve his community, he knew there was still much work to be done. He wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges along the way. But with each day, he felt more confident in his ability to make a difference. He had learned that being a good officer wasn't just about knowing the law. It was about knowing the people you serve and doing your best to treat them with the dignity and respect they deserved. For Reynolds, this new approach to policing wasn't just a career change, it was a life change. And with each positive interaction, he was building a better future, not just for himself, but for the community he cared so deeply about. As Officer Reynolds continued his work, he became more aware of the significant shift that had taken place within him. The lessons he had learned from Captain Johnson were still fresh in his mind, and every day he saw more evidence of the transformation in the way he approached his job. The hard black and white boundaries of the law had started to blur into a softer, more compassionate approach, one where understanding, empathy, and connection were just as important as enforcing the rules. One afternoon, while on his usual patrol, Reynolds drove through a part of the neighborhood that he had always known to be a little rougher around the edges. As he passed by a small park, he noticed a group of teenagers hanging out, laughing and talking amongst themselves. In the past, Reynolds might have driven by without giving them a second thought, but today something made him pause. He had learned that even a brief interaction with someone could change their day, and he knew that the way he treated these young people could have a lasting effect. He parked his car and walked over to the group, his steps light, his demeanor friendly. The teens glanced up, surprised at first, but Reynolds just smiled. "Hey guys," he said casually, "how's everything going today?" The teens were hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect. They had grown used to officers driving by with little more than a scowl or an order to move along. But as Reynolds stood there, not as an enforcer but as a person, they began to relax. One of the teens, a girl with bright eyes, stepped forward. "We're good, just hanging out," she said, her tone a little cautious but not unfriendly. "I'm glad to hear that," Reynolds said, his voice warm. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about how we all treat each other, you know, and I just wanted to check in with you guys." The girl smiled, and her friends seemed to soften as well. They weren't used to a police officer taking an interest in them, and it felt good to be acknowledged as people rather than just potential troublemakers. Reynolds chatted with them for a while, asking about school, their plans for the future, and how they were spending their summer. The conversation wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't about solving their problems or offering grand advice, but it was genuine. By the end of their conversation, the group of teenagers seemed more relaxed, more at ease. They had seen a side of an officer that they didn't often see, someone who was just another person trying to make the world a little better. As Reynolds got back into his patrol car, he felt a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't the kind of interaction that would make the headlines, but it was the kind of moment that mattered. It was the kind of connection that could plant a seed of respect and trust, one that might grow over time and lead to a stronger relationship between the police and the community. Later that week, Reynolds was assigned to a different area, one that had seen its share of issues with crime. This part of town was known for its tight-knit community, but it also faced the pressures of poverty, unemployment, and crime. Many people in the area felt like they were caught in a cycle, constantly facing challenges that were out of their control. In the past, Reynolds would have focused on the crime statistics and the need to stop the criminals, but now he saw something else. He saw the people who lived there, people with hopes and dreams just like anyone else. As he drove through the neighborhood, he made a point to stop and speak with a few residents. He greeted an elderly woman sitting on her porch, asking if she needed help with anything. She smiled and shook her head, but she appreciated the gesture. He chatted briefly with a man who was working on his car, offering a friendly word about the weather. It wasn't about solving big problems or making any grand statements. It was just about showing up, being present, and making a real connection with the people in the neighborhood. By the time Reynolds finished his shift, he realized how much he had changed. His perspective on policing, on community, on people had evolved in ways he couldn't have imagined just months ago. He wasn't focused on the numbers anymore. The crime rates, the arrests, the tickets. Those things still mattered, of course, but they no longer defined his work. What defined his work now was how he treated the people he served, how he made them feel seen, heard, and respected. Reynolds knew that this wasn't always going to be easy. There would be tough situations, difficult people, and moments when his patience would be tested. But he also knew that the work he was doing was important, that the changes he was making, no matter how small, were making a difference. He had learned that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about being willing to change, to grow, and to try every day to be better. One evening, as Reynolds was finishing his paperwork at the precinct, Captain Johnson walked by and gave him a nod. "How's it going, Officer Reynolds?" he asked, a smile on his face. Reynolds returned the smile, feeling a sense of gratitude for the captain's guidance. "It's going well, sir. I'm getting better at this, I think. Slowly but surely." The captain's eyes softened. "I knew you would," he said. "You've got the right heart for the job." Reynolds felt a warm sense of pride at the captain's words. He still had a long way to go, but he was confident that he was on the right path. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was a part of the community, someone who could make a real difference, not by following the rules blindly, but by seeing the people he served as individuals, each with their own stories and struggles. As Reynolds left the precinct that night, the cool evening air felt refreshing. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to connect with people, and continue growing. But for now, he felt at peace. He was no longer just a police officer enforcing the law. He was a human being, working to make the world a better place, one small connection at a time. And that, to him, was enough.